Hey everybody, welcome back to JBS for what could quite possibly be the last week of JBS study this term. We've almost made it, guys. We've been looking at the parables of Jesus, and I hope you've been learning a lot along with each other. And I hope you've been discussing what you've been learning with each other as well. We're going to be doing yet another parable today. This time we're going to be doing the parable of the persistent widow. This is from Luke chapter 18 verses 1 to 8. So this is kind of a little point where you pause the video, grab your Bibles, read through the passage, and then hit play on the video, and we continue with what it kind of talks about. So why don't you go and do that now? Yeah. Once again, parables are kind of weird, but I think this one is really, really important because it talks about us as people and how we respond to the world around us and who God is as a person and how those two things relate. And so let's just kind of have a little look at the parable in more detail. And so there's this parable that Jesus is talking about a judge who didn't fear God or fear people. He kind of just cared about himself. And so when this widow comes to him, he doesn't care about distributing justice to her because he doesn't care about her, he cares about himself. And he refuses for a time, but eventually he gives in and he distributes justice to this widow. And so Jesus wraps up by saying that we should be paying attention to what this unjust judge says, and will not God bring about justice for his chosen ones who cry out to him day and night? Will he keep putting them off? I tell you, he will see that they get justice and quickly. However, when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on the earth? So in that little section there, that little ending conclusion by Jesus, we get an insight into God and who he is. He is a God of justice. He wants to distribute this justice, and he does distribute justice. He's one who longs to see this justice brought out in the world. But let's kind of take a little bit of a step back and have a look about what this passage is about. And I do think that justice is the big idea, but I think because of what Jesus says kind of at the end, we kind of relate back to what the unjust judge says, right? He says, listen to these words closely. So let's have a little look at that. The judge says, even though I don't fear God or care what people think, yet because this widow keeps bothering me, I will see that she gets justice so that she won't eventually come and attack me. So, what does that have to do with God? Well, I think it has to do with the characters of the people dispensing justice, right? So the judge in the parable, he doesn't care, right? He's into it for himself. He just cares about himself. He doesn't care about justice or distributing it. So he eventually dishes out this justice because people keep, nagging at him. God, on the other hand, he is a just God. He wants to distribute justice. And so when people cry out to him, it's all the more likely that he will respond. He does not ignore, these people who cry out to him. We see that kind of through the Bible as well. In the Exodus narrative, in Jesus, we're told in Exodus, in Exodus narrative in Exodus, where we're told that the Israelites groaned out to God in their slavery. They had groaning, lifted that up to heaven. God's heard it. He was, what was the emotion? He was moved, or something along those lines. You guys can have a look at it in the early Exodus chapters. But he heard that cry and he cared for them. And so he responded by leading them out of Egypt and, justly dealing with the Egyptians and all the evil they had been doing towards the Israelites. I think there's also something we said about the character of the woman herself. This widow kept coming to him with the plea, grant me justice against my adversary. I think that verb, she kept coming, is really important because it tells us that she has faith in the judicial system, right? She has faith in the judge. She has faith that he will enact judgment. And because of that faith, she does not take it upon herself to be the judge. She does not go around distributing punishments. She recognizes that that is the role of the judge, and so she gives that role over to him. And that's why she keeps coming to him rather than dishing out that judgment on her own. Oh, goodness. So, what does this all kind of mean? How does that relate to people today? Because, it might mean something a little bit different, or, the people might have interpreted it differently many years ago. But I think that there are 3 big points to kind of bring out of this. And I think, again, it comes down to character. It comes down to your character as a person and as a Christian, and how that influences you. And then how and how knowing who God is influences you as a person as well. So we know that God is a righteous God, right? He judges rightly, and he demands justice. And then how does that relate to us? Well, similarly to the woman, we don't take justice into our own hands, right? We don't cry out when we hear injustice in the world, because we know that God will respond to that, right? He will cast judgment, and perhaps that might not take place in today or tomorrow or even in this lifetime, but no person can escape that final judgment before God. That is the ultimate act of justice, right? Is people coming before him and God saying, well, all right, why did you do this bad thing on May 17th, 2016? And they have to give an account, and God will judge them for it. And so we give that role over to God. We are not the judge, and so we should not be judging people, and we should not then be enacting our own judgment on them. That's not what we should be. We should be the people who have mercy and love, and try to bring them into God's family, even though they don't deserve it, because we also don't deserve it. Point number 2, justice is coming, right? We have that promise of final justice, which means that, kind of like what I was kind of talking about earlier, we don't take judgment into our hands, but also when we don't have the opportunity to take our justice into our hands, or we don't see people getting justice, we shouldn't feel like they've been cheated, or like they have such a great life, or that they've gotten away with it, because they haven't. And that goes back to that final judgment time when everybody stands before God. If we see people across the world who are doing great, horrendous, evil things, and they don't get tried for it, or even if they do get tried for it and they get away with it, we know that they won't get away from God. God will judge them eventually. And so we can feel a great peace within ourselves when we see these people getting away with it, because we know that, well, they don't get away with it. It might look like they do, and they might feel like they do, but they have an even worse judgment coming, and that is divine judgment. And so we give that over to God, and we let him do that judging, and we trust that he will judge rightly and give them what they deserve. And the third point is related to the last part, the verse 8. Jesus says, I tell you, he that is God will see that they get justice, and quickly. However, when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on the earth? And I think this is especially important, because this still relates to the idea of justice. That's what Jesus is talking about, and the Son of Man is a term for Jesus. So if we can kind of decode that, he's saying that when Jesus comes back, will he find faithful? And some way that relates to justice. And I think what Jesus is saying is that it's very easy to look at the injustice of the world and think God isn't there, right? God is letting this evil go unpunished. And so therefore God can't exist, or God can't care, or all these other ifs and buts about suffering and evil. But that's not the case. Habakkuk is a great example of that. He's a minor prophet, and his entire book is kind of about how he sees injustice and evil in the world, and he cries out to God saying, how can this be? And God says, look, man, do you have faith? Do you believe in me? Do you trust me? And by the end of the book, Habakkuk has this great transformation from this guy who cries out against God to come into this revelation, this conclusion that actually, you know what, God, you've got it. I'm going to trust you. And I think that's something that Christians should try to mimic, right? When we see the injustice in the world, it is injustice. And we shouldn't be happy about it. We shouldn't glorify it. We shouldn't think that it's a good thing. But likewise, it shouldn't, and well, it could quite possibly just disgust us with what we're hearing and seeing. That's a perfectly normal reaction. But it doesn't mean that God doesn't care. It doesn't mean that God isn't there. Because we know that they aren't going to get away with it. That's kind of the big point of this, is that justice will get done. It will be done by God's hand. And so we need to be faithful that when we see all of these things happening in the world, that this is not the end of it, right? A person's sins does not end when they die. It actually, kind of only ends if you're going to God with faith into the new creation, because you stand in your sins in Judgment Day, and then you get perfected, and then you kind of go off. Unless you don't have faith, in which case judgment is pulled out on you, and you get subjected to God's wrath. But those are my three kind of big points. So justice is coming. We need to be assured of that and be patient with each other and with the world around us. We shouldn't take justice or judgment into our own hands, and we should remain faithful in the face of all the evil and suffering in the world. Those are my thoughts on this parable. If you have any of your own, feel free to drop a little comment in the section below. Next week we're going to be doing something a little bit different. You might remember last term when I kind of sat down with Barry and talked about the topic of biblical theology. Well, I'm going to be doing something really similar. I'm going to be sitting down with someone, a special guest, and we're going to be talking about parables. Look forward to that. I'm really looking forward to it. I will hope that you guys enjoyed as much as I will. Until then, have a good week, guys.